Get that vagrant off my firing line before he gets his head blown off. Gunnery Sergeant Terrence Vidal's voice cut across the known distance range like a bullet itself, sharp and dismissive and absolutely certain of its authority. The autumn wind carried his words to every corner of the training facility, past the firing positions where young Marines lay prone with precision rifles, past the instructor tower where spotting scopes tracked downrange, past the memorial wall where photographs of legendary snipers watched over their successors with silent pride. The vagrant in question stood motionless at the edge of the range, just inside the perimeter fence where the grass met gravel. He was a wiry man somewhere past 70, his skin weathered to leather by decades of sun and hardship, his close-cropped gray hair revealing a scalp marked by old scars. His left eye had gone cloudy, the iris fogged by shrapnel damage that had never healed properly. He wore a faded utility jacket held together with safety pins where the buttons had long since vanished, boots with soles separating from uppers, and he carried a worn green rucksack that contained everything he owned in this world. His name was Clement Okonkwo, though no one on this range knew that yet. No one knew anything about him except what their eyes told them, and their eyes told them he was homeless, confused, and absolutely did not belong anywhere near Marine Corps Scout Sniper School during qualification week. Clem did not move when the gunnery sergeant shouted. He did not flinch when heads turned toward him, when young Marines in the observation area began to snicker, when the weight of institutional contempt settled on his shoulders like a familiar burden. He simply stood there, watching the wind move through the grass with an intensity that looked like madness to those who did not understand what they were seeing. The grass bent and straightened in patterns. The leaves from nearby oaks tumbled in trajectories that told stories to those who knew how to read them. The mirage rising from the ground at various distances shimmered and danced, revealing temperature differentials and air currents that no instrument could fully capture. Clem saw all of it, calculated all of it, the way he had been calculating wind since before most of these young Marines were born. Security approached him first, two military police officers with hands resting on their duty belts and expressions that mixed boredom with mild irritation. Another homeless veteran wandering onto federal property. They saw it more often than anyone wanted to admit. "Just watching, sir," Clem said before they could speak. His voice was soft, roughened by years of disuse and exposure. "Not bothering anyone." "Sir, you cannot be on this range," the senior MP said. "It is an active training facility. You need to come with us." "I understand." Clem nodded slowly, but his eyes never left the range. He watched a student at the 1,000-yard line struggle with wind calls, adjusting and readjusting based on data from a Kestrel weather meter that was already obsolete by the time the numbers registered. "Used to teach here. Long time ago." The MPs exchanged glances. The kind of glance that said they had heard this before, that every confused old man who wandered onto military property claimed some connection to justify his presence. Gunnery Sergeant Vidal strode toward them, his boots striking the ground with the confidence of a man who controlled everything within his domain. He was 34 years old, accomplished, decorated with combat deployments and confirmed kills that he did not discuss in polite company. He believed absolutely in the superiority of modern technology, in ballistic computers and wind meters and data-driven precision that had supposedly perfected the ancient art of reaching out and touching someone from impossible distances. He looked at Clement Okonkwo and saw nothing but a problem to be removed. "What is the situation here?" Vidal demanded. "Sir claims he used to teach here," the MP reported. Vidal's laugh was short and sharp and utterly without humor. He looked at Clem's ragged jacket, his separating boots, his clouded eye that suggested damage and decline. "Sure you did. And I'm a commandant of the Marine Corps." Students began gathering at the edge of the observation area, drawn by the commotion. A confrontation was more interesting than watching their classmates fail shot after shot in the impossible wind conditions that had plagued this qualification cycle. Most of them snickered at the homeless man's claim. A few recorded the encounter on their phones, anticipating content worth sharing later. One did not laugh. Private First Class Tomas Arriaga stood apart from his classmates, his face drawn with the particular misery of a man who had failed his wind reading practical twice and faced elimination from the program with one more miss. He watched the old man with something other than contempt. Perhaps it was recognition of shared desperation. Perhaps it was simply the exhaustion that came from watching his dream die by degrees. Clem's eyes found him across the distance. Something passed between them, brief and unspoken. Understanding. "Get him off my range," Vidal ordered. "I have students qualifying, and I do not need distractions." But before the MPs could move, a woman's voice cut through the dismissal. She was Master Sergeant Lydia Crow, the range master, 28 years in the Corps, and possessed of instincts that had kept her alive through 3 combat deployments. She had been watching the homeless man since he appeared at the fence, and something about him would not let her look away. "Hold on," Crow said. She walked closer, studying Clem with eyes that missed nothing. The way he stood despite his ragged appearance. The way his hands remained absolutely still even as the rest of him showed signs of age and neglect. The way he watched the wind. "What unit did you serve with?" she asked. "Scout Sniper, 1st Marine Division," Clem replied. "Instructor here from 82 through 93. Vidal scoffed. "There is no record of any instructor matching your description in our files. I checked when security first reported you at the fence last week." Clem's expression did not change. "Records do not keep everything, Gunnery Sergeant. Especially not from before they put everything on computers." The wind gusted hard, sending leaves spiraling across the range and causing the student on the firing line to curse as his carefully calculated shot went wide. Another miss. Another failure in conditions that seemed designed to break them. Clem watched the wind die down, watched it rebuild, watched patterns that no instrument could fully capture. His lips moved silently, calculating, always calculating. If you're watching this story right now, from anywhere in the world, take a moment to let us know where you're joining us from. Drop a comment below with your city or country. Stories like this one, about forgotten experts hiding in plain sight, happen everywhere. There might be someone in your own community whose humble appearance conceals extraordinary abilities. If tales of hidden skill and second chances speak to you, please consider subscribing to our channel so you don't miss what happens next. Now, let us continue. Vidal's patience had expired. "I do not care what he claims," the gunnery sergeant declared. "He is a distraction and a liability. Remove him from the premises." The MPs moved forward, hands reaching for Clem's arms. In exactly 47 minutes, everything these young Marines believed about expertise and appearance and the limits of human capability would shatter like a target under precision fire. They would learn what happens when you mistake humility for weakness, when you confuse poverty with incompetence, when you forget that the deadliest shooters in the world never needed to announce themselves. But right now, Clement Okonkwo allowed himself to be escorted toward the gate, his clouded eye fixed on a range where students continued to fail shots he could have made in his sleep. "Still here, brother," he whispered to a dead man 33 years in the ground. "Still watching. They forgot what we knew." The smell hit him before the memories did. Gun oil and brass, and the particular scent of a rifle range that never fully left the air no matter how many years passed. Clem breathed it in as the MPs walked him toward the gate, and suddenly he was not a 70-year-old homeless man being escorted off federal property. He was 17 years old, standing on yellow footprints at Paris Island with a lie about his age and nothing in the world to lose. The MPs were talking to each other about shift changes and weekend plans. They did not notice that their detainee had gone somewhere else entirely, his clouded eye seeing things that existed only in the amber of memory. Boot camp had revealed it first, the gift that his grandmother had given him without either of them knowing what it was. Young Clement Okonkwo from nothing and nowhere had stepped onto the rifle range for qualification, and something had clicked into place like a round chambering home. He hit targets that other recruits could barely see, adjusted for wind without being taught how, sent rounds downrange with a consistency that made his drill instructors stop their screaming and simply watch. One of them had pulled him aside after qualification. A weathered staff sergeant with Korea in his eyes and 3 wars worth of killing in his hands. Boy, where did you learn to shoot like that? My grandmother, sir. Clem had not known what else to say. She said if you listen, the wind tells you where to send the bullet. The staff sergeant had stared at him for a long moment. Then he had made a phone call that changed the trajectory of Clement Okonkwo's entire life. Scout Sniper School, the most demanding program the Marine Corps offered for those who could reach out and touch the enemy from distances that seemed impossible. Clem had not just passed. He had excelled in ways that rewrote expectations. Vietnam came next. The jungle where wind behaved differently than anywhere else on Earth, where humidity and vegetation created conditions that defeated lesser shooters. Clem adapted. Read the environment like scripture, sent rounds through gaps in canopy that should not have existed, hitting targets that intelligence said could not be reached. The nickname came from a colonel who watched him work during a demonstration shoot. This man reads the wind like scripture, the colonel had said to his aide. Like he wrote the damn book on it. What do they call him? Okonkwo, sir. No, his call sign. What do the men call him? The aide had smiled. Wind readers, sir. The MPs stopped at the gate. Clem blinked, returning to the present, to his aching joints and his separating boots and the weight of 30 years of guilt that never got lighter no matter how far he walked. Sir, you cannot return to this facility, the senior MP was saying. Do you understand? If you are found on the premises again, you will be arrested for trespassing. I understand, Clem said. They released him outside the gate. The wind gusted, carrying the sound of another missed shot from the range. Another young Marine failing in conditions that Clem could have navigated blindfolded. He should have walked away, should have returned to the overpass 3 miles distant where he had made his home among the concrete pillars. Should have forgotten about this place and the ghosts that lived here. Instead, he moved along the fence line until he found a spot where he could see the range through the chain link. The same spot he had occupied every day for the past 2 weeks, watching, remembering, mourning. Darnell would have hated what they had done to this place. The thought came unbidden, as thoughts of Lance Corporal Darnell Whitmore always did. 6 years they had worked together. Shooter and spotter. 2 halves of the same lethal organism. Darnell had been young and full of laughter and absolutely convinced that Clem could do things with a rifle that defied physics. You're a wizard, Whitmore used to say. Straight up wizard with that wind reading. Just paying attention, Clem would reply. The wind does not lie. It just speaks a language most folks never learn. Darnell had learned it. Not the way Clem knew it, not with the same intuitive gift, but well enough to be the finest spotter Clem had ever worked with. They had developed a shorthand over the years, a language of micro-gestures and abbreviated calls that let them work faster than any team in the division. Then Kuwait, February 1991. The intelligence that came in hot about a high-value target. Narrow window, 1,400 meters through desert air that shimmered with heat and deception. Clement set up. Darnell had called the wind. Send it, wind reader. The trigger pull. The round leaving the barrel at velocities that turned physics into faith. And then, in the microsecond between firing and impact, the wind had shifted. A gust that came from nowhere and everywhere, pushing the bullet just enough to miss flesh and strike metal. The sound had echoed across the desert like a dinner bell for death. They never saw the mortar team that responded. Never had time to relocate. Darnell had seen it first, had shoved Clem toward cover with strength born of desperation. The shrapnel had taken him in the chest and throat. Clem had held him as the blood came, as the light faded from eyes that had always been laughing at something. Darnell's last words came out wet and broken. Was not the wind, Clem. Was the war. Do not you dare stop shooting because of me. But Clem had stopped, had finished his deployment on autopilot, then mustered out as soon as his obligation ended. Could not look through a scope without seeing Darnell's face in the crosshairs of his memory. His wife, Rosalind, had held him together for 15 years, had understood without needing explanation, had loved him through the nightmares and the silence, and the way he sometimes disappeared inside himself for days at a time. Then cancer had taken her too. 8 years ago. And without her anchor, Clem had drifted. Lost the house. Lost his purpose. Lost everything except the green rucksack and the guilt and the 1943 steel penny that Darnell's grandfather had carried through World War II. On the range, another shot missed. Clem watched the wind pattern that had caused it, saw exactly where the student's calculation had failed. They forgot, brother, he whispered through the chain link. They forgot what you and me knew. The wind does not lie. It just speaks a language they stopped teaching. The steel penny was warm in his pocket, rubbed smooth by 3 generations of worried fingers. Not lucky. Darnell had never believed in luck. But it was something to hold when the memories got too heavy. Clem pressed his forehead against the chain link and watched the students fail and wondered if Darnell would forgive him for walking away from everything they had built together. The security escort had taken him past the memorial wall on the way to the gate, and Clem had not been able to stop himself from slowing as they passed. Glass cases lined the corridor, filled with photographs of the men who had shaped this program into what it was. Legends who had sent rounds downrange when the stakes were life and death and the margin for error was measured in heartbeats. He had known some of them, trained with others, buried a few. His finger had hovered near the glass without touching it, drawn to a photograph from the 1980s that showed an instructor demonstrating shooting position to a group of students. The instructor's face was partially turned away from the camera, but there was something familiar in the hands, the posture, the way the body settled into the rifle like water, finding its level. The caption read simply, Wind Reading Practical, circa 1987. Instructor unknown. Clem had said nothing. Let the MPs lead him away from the photograph that no one had bothered to label properly, from a legacy that had been erased when a program modernized and decided that machines knew better than the men who had written the techniques in blood. Now he stood at the fence, watching through chain link as the qualification exercise collapsed into frustration and failure. The wind today was what instructors called washing machine conditions, gusting from multiple directions, swirling unpredictably, changing speed and angle every few seconds. The ballistic computers that students relied upon could not keep up. By the time a Kestrel weather meter registered a reading and a shooter adjusted, the wind had already shifted to something else entirely. Gunnery Sergeant Vidal paced behind the firing line, his earlier confidence eroding with each missed shot. This class was falling behind schedule. Graduation rates determined funding. Funding determined his future. Every miss was a black mark on a record he had built through years of careful career management. Master Sergeant Crow watched from the instructor tower, her instincts still nagging at her about the homeless man they had removed. Something about his hands, the way they had remained perfectly still even as the rest of him showed signs of age and hard living. Hands like that did not come from nowhere. She pulled up the historical records on her tablet, searching through digitized files from before her time, looking for something she could not name but would recognize when she found it. On the firing line, Private First Class Arriaga took his position for what he knew might be his final attempt. 2 failures already. One more, and he was out of the program, his dream of becoming a scout sniper dead before it ever truly lived. His spotter lay beside him, calling wind data from the Kestrel. 8 miles per hour from the left, adjusting to 6, now back to 9. The numbers were useless. By the time Arriaga processed them and adjusted his aim, the wind had changed again. He was chasing ghosts with technology that could not keep pace with nature. He squeezed the trigger anyway, sent the round downrange with a prayer that felt more like surrender. Mississippi. The spotter's voice was flat, already resigned. Arriaga did not move from his position, could not make himself rise and walk away from everything he had worked toward. The scope showed him the target, untouched, mocking him from 1,000 yards away. That is 3, Vidal announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. Arriaga, you're done. Clear the line. The words hit like physical blows. Arriaga began to gather his gear, movements slow and mechanical, the motions of a man whose body continued functioning while his spirit collapsed inward. As he walked from the firing line toward the observation area, his path took him near the perimeter fence, near the spot where the homeless man still stood, watching through chain link with that strange intensity that looked like madness, but might have been something else entirely. Arriaga stopped. He did not know why. Perhaps it was the need to delay his return to the barracks where he would pack his gear in silence. Perhaps it was something in the old man's eyes that seemed to understand failure in ways that went beyond a missed qualification. You said something earlier, Arriaga found himself saying. About the mirage. About watching where it bends. What did you mean? Clem studied the young Marine through the fence. Saw the devastation written across his features. Saw something else beneath it, something that reminded him of Darnell in the early days. The hunger to learn, the willingness to trust. The mirage tells you what the instruments cannot measure, Clem said softly. Heat rising from the ground bends light. The way it bends shows you air movement at distances your Kestrel cannot read. You watch the mirage at 200 meters, at 400, at 600. You see how it shifts differently at each point. That tells you what the wind is doing along the entire path of your bullet. Arriaga stared at him. This was not in any manual he had studied, not part of any lecture he had attended. They do not teach that anymore, he said. No, they teach the machines instead. Clem's clouded. I seem to see something far away. The machines are useful, but they cannot feel what the wind is about to do. Only a man can do that. Only a man who learns to listen. Arriaga opened his mouth to ask another question, but Vidal's voice cut across the distance like a blade. Arriaga, do not talk to that vagrant. Get back to barracks and pack your gear. You are finished here. The gunnery sergeant strode toward them, his face tight with the frustration of a day gone wrong in every possible way. He glared at Clem through the fence. I told security to remove you permanently. If I see you here again, I will have you arrested. Clem did not respond to the threat. His eyes remained on Arriaga, on the young man who was walking away from his dream with shoulders hunched against a weight that had nothing to do with his pack. He has the gift, Clem said quietly, not caring if Vidal heard. That boy, he has the eyes for it. You just never taught him how to use them. Vidal's laugh was harsh and dismissive. And I suppose you could teach him. A homeless vagrant who claims he used to work here decades ago. He stepped closer to the fence, close enough that Clem could smell his aftershave, could see the contempt carved into every line of his face. I have trained more snipers than you have had hot meals, old man. I do not need advice from someone who cannot even keep a roof over his head. The wind gusted hard. Somewhere on the range, another student missed another shot. The sound of failure echoed across the facility like a judgment. Clem said nothing. There was nothing to say that would penetrate the armor of certainty that Vidal had built around himself. He simply stood there, watching the wind move through the grass in patterns that told stories the gunnery sergeant would never be able to read. Darnell's voice whispered in his memory, "Do not you dare stop shooting because of me." But he had stopped, and now a generation of young Marines was learning to trust machines instead of their own eyes. And the gift that Clem had tried to pass on was fading from institutional memory, like morning mist burning off under an uncaring sun. The conversation with Arriaga had opened something in Clem that he had kept sealed for decades. Walking back toward the overpass where he made his home, he found himself unable to outrun the memories that pursued him like tracers in the dark. Darnell Whitmore had been 23 years old when they first partnered together. A kid from Detroit who talked too much and laughed too loud and had an almost supernatural ability to read terrain. He could find a hide in landscapes that offered no concealment, calculate distances with nothing but his eyes and a formula he kept in his head. Their first deployment together had been a disaster of miscommunication and mutual suspicion. Clem was already a legend by then, a master sergeant with kills across multiple theaters who had burned through spotters the way other men burned through cigarettes. None of them could keep up with his methods. None of them trusted the wind the way he did. Darnell had been different. You do not use the data the young Lance Corporal had observed after their third mission together. You look at the Kestrel, but you do not use what it tells you. I use it to confirm what I already know, Clem had replied. The machine tells me what the wind is doing right now, right here. But the bullet has to travel 1,000 meters through air that is doing different things at different points. The machine cannot see all of that. I can. Darnell had been quiet for a long moment. Then he had asked the question that changed everything between them. Can you teach me? No one had ever asked before. Other spotters had simply accepted that Clem operated on a level they could not reach, had done their jobs competently without trying to understand the gift that made their shooter supernatural. Darnell wanted to understand. So Clem had taught him, night after night, in whatever hooch or hide they occupied. He had explained the principles that his grandmother had planted in him decades before. How to read mirage, how to feel the weight of humidity in the air, how to watch vegetation at multiple distances and synthesize the information into a single coherent picture of what the wind was doing along the entire bullet path. Darnell never developed the intuitive gift that Clem possessed, but he learned enough to become the finest spotter in the division, able to anticipate what Clem needed before he needed it, able to call corrections that accounted for variables the instruments missed. They became something more than a sniper team. They became brothers in the way that only men who have killed together and nearly died together can become brothers. Clem reached the overpass as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. His spot was undisturbed, the concrete alcove he had chosen for its tactical advantages still holding his few possessions. Sight lines in 3 directions. Cover from weather and observation. A soldier's instincts never fully died, even when everything else had. He settled onto the cardboard that served as his mattress and pulled the green rucksack close. Inside were the only things that mattered anymore. A photograph of Rosalind on their wedding day, her smile bright enough to illuminate the darkness of any memory. His dog tags, worn smooth by decades against his chest. Darnell's dog tags, which Clem had pulled from his body before the medevac arrived. And the steel penny, that 1943 wartime relic that connected 3 generations of warriors. Darnell's grandfather had carried it through the beaches of Normandy and the forests of the Ardennes, had pressed it into young Darnell's palm when the boy shipped out for his first deployment. This is not lucky, the old man had said. Luck is for fools who think the universe cares about them. This is a reminder that the men who came before you are watching, that you carry their hopes when you carry this coin. Darnell had told Clem that story during a long night in a hide overlooking a valley in Afghanistan. They had been waiting for a target that never appeared, passing the hours with whispered conversations about family and fear and the strange peace that came from doing work that mattered. When I die, Darnell had said with the casual fatalism of young men who have seen too much death, I want you to have this. Pass it to somebody who needs it. You are not going to die, Clem had replied. Everybody dies, Vintrida. The question is whether you leave something behind that matters. 7 months later, Clem had pulled the penny from Darnell's pocket while his spotter's blood soaked into the sand. Had carried it every day since, waiting for someone worthy to pass it to. 33 years of waiting. 33 years of carrying a dead man's hope in his pocket alongside his own crushing guilt. The image of Arriaga's face surfaced in his mind. The devastation in those young eyes. The hunger that had survived even the destruction of his dream. The way he had stopped at the fence and asked about the mirage, seeking knowledge even in the moment of his greatest failure. He has the gift, Clem thought. That boy could be great if someone taught him what the machines cannot measure. But teaching meant picking up the rifle again. Meant looking through scopes that would show him Darnell's face in every crosshair. Meant breaking the promise he had made to himself when he walked away from everything that had defined him. Darnell's voice echoed in his memory, wet and broken and absolute in its final command. Do not you dare stop shooting because of me. Clem pulled the steel penny from his pocket and held it up to catch the fading light. The face of Lincoln had been worn nearly smooth by generations of worried fingers. But the date was still visible, 1943. The year the country had been so desperate for copper that they made pennies from steel instead. Desperate times calling for desperate measures. Maybe that was what Darnell had been trying to tell him all along. That the promise to stop had been the wrong promise. That honoring the dead meant living fully, not hiding under bridges while the knowledge they had built together faded from memory. Maybe, but maybes were easier to contemplate than action. And the weight of 33 years of guilt was not something that could be set aside in a single evening of reflection. Clem closed his fingers around the penny and let the darkness settle over his alcove like a familiar blanket. Tomorrow he would return to the fence, would watch the students fail in conditions he could navigate blindfolded, would carry the weight of what he knew and what he had lost and what he might still be able to give if he could find the courage to try. Still here, brother, he whispered to the ghost that never left his side. Still trying to figure out what you wanted me to do. The next morning broke gray and gusty, the wind even more unpredictable than the day before. Clem had walked the 3 miles to the range before dawn, his joints protesting with every step, but his mind clearer than it had been in years. He found his spot at the fence and waited for the range to come alive. The students arrived in small groups, their faces carrying the particular tension of men who knew they were running out of chances. Qualification deadline was Friday, 2 days away, and the wind showed no signs of cooperating. Gunnery Sergeant Vidal arrived with a colonel that Clem did not recognize. The older officer moved with the careful authority of high rank, his uniform immaculate, his bearings suggesting decades of service. He watched the range with the evaluating gaze of someone whose opinion determined futures. Colonel Reginald Stanhope, Clem would learn later, commanding officer of the training facility. A man who had served as a young lieutenant when Clem was still teaching, though their paths had never directly crossed. He had come to observe qualification week, and what he observed was not encouraging. On the firing line, students cycled through their attempts with increasing desperation. The Kestrel meters gave readings that were obsolete before they could be applied. Ballistic computers calculated solutions for wind conditions that had already changed. Miss after miss echoed across the range, each one another nail in the coffin of careers that had not yet begun. Vidal grew more agitated with each failure. His voice rose in volume and sharpened in tone as he berated students for their inability to adapt. His carefully constructed training program was collapsing in real time, and the colonel was watching every moment of its disintegration. "These conditions are impossible," Master Sergeant Crow said quietly, standing beside the colonel in the observation tower. "No one is qualifying today. The enemy does not wait for perfect conditions," Vidal snapped back. "These students need to learn to adapt." "They cannot adapt to what they cannot read," Crow replied. "The computers cannot keep up with this wind. There is no data for them to adapt to. Then they're not ready to be snipers." Stanhope said nothing. His silence was more damning than any criticism. At the fence, Clem watched the disaster unfold with growing frustration. He could see exactly what was happening, could read the patterns that the instruments missed. The wind was not truly chaotic. It had structure, rhythm, predictability. But that predictability existed on a timescale too fast for machines to capture and too subtle for untrained eyes to perceive. The students were chasing the wind instead of anticipating it, reacting to data instead of feeling the truth that the data could only approximate. A figure approached along the fence line. Clem tensed, expecting security, but it was someone else entirely. A woman in Navy chaplain insignia, her face kind but unsmiling, carrying a paper bag that smelled of fresh bread. "You have been watching this range for weeks," Chaplain Frances O'Yelleran said. She did not ask permission before settling onto the grass beside him, did not treat him with the careful distance that most people used around the homeless. "I have seen you at the perimeter. Left you some sandwiches a few times." Clem remembered, food appearing near his spot at the fence, always when he had stepped away briefly. He had assumed it was other homeless leaving offerings, the unspoken charity of those who had nothing sharing with those who had less. "That was you," he said. "I notice people," the chaplain replied. "It is part of my job, and I notice that you do not watch this range like a curious bystander. You watch it like a man who knows what he is seeing." Clem was quiet for a moment. On the range, another shot missed. Another young Marine's dreams dying by degrees. "I used to teach here," he finally said, before they decided machines knew better than men. The chaplain nodded as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. "What happened to make you leave?" The question was simple and devastating. Clem's hand found the steel penny in his pocket, the familiar weight anchoring him against the tide of memory. "I lost my spotter," he said. "Kuwait. 33 years ago. He died because I missed a shot that gave away our position. And you blamed yourself. The wind did something I did not predict. I should have waited. Should have trusted my instincts instead of rushing the shot. He took shrapnel pushing me into cover. Bled out in 90 seconds. Chaplain O'Yelleran did not offer platitudes. Did not tell him it was not his fault or that he needed to forgive himself. She simply sat with him in the weight of his confession, present without judgment. "Your spotter," she said after a long silence. "What would I want you to do now?" Clem almost laughed. The same question he had been asking himself for 3 decades. "He told me not to stop shooting because of him. Last thing he said before he died. But you stopped anyway." "I stopped everything. Could not look through a scope without seeing his face. Could not teach without hearing his voice calling wind. So I walked away. Let them erase my name from the program when they modernized. Let the techniques I developed become footnotes that nobody reads." On the range, Vidal's voice rose in another frustrated tirade. A student had just failed his final attempt, eliminated from the program in conditions that no amount of training could have prepared him for. "That boy yesterday," the chaplain said carefully. "The one you spoke to through the fence. He had something, did he not?" Clem nodded slowly. "He has the gift. The eyes for it. Just needs someone to show him what the machines cannot measure." "Could you show him?" The question hung in the air between them, heavier than the humid wind that continued to confound every student on the range. Clem watched the young Marine pack his gear and walk away from the firing line, shoulders hunched with defeat. Another career ended. Another gift wasted because no one had taught him to trust his eyes instead of his instruments. "I made a promise to myself," Clem said, "when Darnell died, that I would never look through a scope again." The chaplain turned to face him directly, her eyes holding the particular compassion of someone who had counseled countless people through their darkest moments. "Maybe you have been keeping the wrong promise," she said softly. "Maybe the promise your spotter wanted was not for you to stop. Maybe it was for you to keep going, to honor what you built together by passing it on." Clem had no answer for that. But for the first time in 33 years, the weight of his guilt felt slightly less immovable than the day before. Master Sergeant Crow could not stop thinking about the homeless man at the fence. She had returned to the memorial wall 3 times since the confrontation, studying the photographs with fresh eyes. Something nagged at her, an itch in her memory that she could not scratch. The way the vagrant had stood, the stillness of his hands, the intensity with which he watched the wind move through the grass. The photograph from 1987 drew her again and again. Wind reading practical, circa 1987. Instructor unknown. She pulled up the historical training records on her computer, searching through files that predated digital archiving. Most of the old documentation had been scanned and uploaded during the modernization push 15 years ago, but the scanning had been rushed and incomplete. Names were missing. Context was lost. An entire generation of institutional knowledge had been reduced to thumbnails and partial captions. The Algonquin method. She found a reference buried in a footnote of the current wind reading manual. A technique for multipoint mirage observation that allowed shooters to calculate wind effects along the entire bullet path rather than relying on single-point measurements. The manual described it as historically significant, but largely superseded by modern instrumentation. The technique had no credited author, just a name that someone had attached to it decades ago, now preserved only in a footnote that most students never bothered to read. Crow dug deeper, found references to training modifications from the early 1990s, when the program had shifted toward technology-assisted shooting. Found memos about streamlining curriculum and removing outdated methodologies. Found a single line in a 1994 administrative document. Instructor records prior to 1990 archived to off-site storage. Contact-based records for retrieval. The trail went cold there. Whatever records existed about pre-1990 instructors were buried in boxes somewhere, inaccessible without formal requests that would take weeks to process. But the photograph remained, and the more Crow looked at it, the more certain she became that she had seen those hands before. That morning, at the fence, attached to a homeless man who claimed he used to teach here. On the range, the afternoon session had collapsed into something approaching despair. The wind had not improved. If anything, it had grown more vicious, gusting and swirling with a randomness that defeated every instrument in the school's arsenal. Vidal had stopped shouting. The silence was worse. He stood at the edge of the firing line, watching his students fail, watching his program's reputation crumble, watching Colonel Stanhope observe everything with that terrible, evaluating gaze. "What is our graduation rate looking like?" the colonel asked quietly. 43%, Crow replied. "If conditions do not improve, it could drop below 30 by Friday." Stanhope's expression did not change, but something in his eyes hardened. 30% graduation would trigger a formal review. Questions about training methods. Questions about leadership. Questions that could end careers. "There has to be something we can do," Vidal said. His voice had lost its earlier arrogance. He sounded like a man watching his future slip away. "Additional training time. Modified qualification standards." "The standards are set by doctrine," Stanhope replied. "I cannot modify them without congressional approval. And additional training time does not help if the fundamental problem is the conditions themselves." Crow thought of the homeless man again, of what he had said to Arriaga through the fence. The mirage tells you what the instruments cannot measure. "What if the problem is not the conditions?" she said slowly. "What if the problem is how we are teaching them to read the conditions?" Both men turned to look at her. "Explain," Stanhope said. Crow chose her words carefully. "Our entire curriculum is built around instrumentation. Kestrel meters, ballistic computers, data-driven solutions. We teach students to trust the machines." "As they should," Vidal interjected. "The technology is more accurate than human estimation." "Is it?" Crow gestured toward the range, toward another student whose shot had just gone wide. "Because right now, the technology is failing completely. The wind is changing faster than the instruments can measure. By the time students get a reading and calculate a solution, the conditions have already shifted." "What alternative is there?" Vidal demanded. "We cannot teach them to guess. There used to be another way." Crow pulled up the training manual on her tablet, scrolled to the footnote. "The Algonquin method, multipoint mirage observation. Reading the wind at multiple distances simultaneously and synthesizing the data intuitively rather than mechanically. That technique is outdated," Vidal said dismissively. "It was removed from primary curriculum years ago. It was removed because we decided machines were more reliable than human observation. But machines are failing us today. And there's a man outside that fence who claims he can teach what the machines cannot measure. The vagrant." Vidal's voice dripped with contempt. "You want me to bring a homeless man onto my range to teach my students? I want you to consider that we might have forgotten something important," Crow replied steadily. "Something that could save this qualification cycle." Stanhope had been listening in silence. Now he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of command. "This man at the fence. You believe he has genuine expertise. I believe he watches the wind differently than anyone I have ever seen," Crow said. "I believe his hands have the steadiness of a shooter, even though the rest of him looks broken. And I believe there's a photograph on our memorial wall that might show him teaching here 30 years ago, except nobody bothered to label it properly." The colonel was quiet for a long moment. The wind gusted, carrying another miss from the range. "Find out who he is," Stanhope finally said. "If there is any chance he can help these students, I want to know about it. And if he is just a confused vagrant with delusions of military service," Vidal asked, "then we will know that too." Stanhope turned back to the range, to the students still struggling against conditions that had become their enemy. "But right now, Gunny, your methods are failing. I am willing to consider alternatives." Crow nodded and headed for the perimeter fence, where a homeless man still stood watching the wind tell secrets that everyone else had forgotten how to hear. Crow found him exactly where she expected, standing at the fence with his eyes tracking patterns in the grass that she could not see. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the range, and in the golden light, the homeless man looked less like a vagrant and more like a sentinel keeping watch over sacred ground. She approached slowly, giving him time to notice her, to decide whether to stay or retreat. He did neither, simply turned his head slightly to acknowledge her presence before returning his attention to the wind. "You came back," she said. "Never left. Just moved down the fence when your MPs got too close." Crow stood beside him, looking through the chain link at the range where her students continued to struggle. The wind had not relented. If anything, the late afternoon thermals had made it worse, adding vertical complexity to the already chaotic horizontal patterns. "I found a reference," she said carefully, "in the training manual. The Okonkwo method. Multipoint mirage observation." Clem's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She would have missed it if she had not been watching for a reaction. "That name means something to you," she pressed. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with a voice that carried the weight of decades, "It used to be my name." Before they decided the technique mattered more than the man who developed it. Crow felt her suspicion crystallize into certainty. "The photograph. 1987. Wind reading practical. That is you in the picture," she said. "On the memorial wall. Teaching students the technique you developed. Nobody bothered to label it." Clem's tone held no bitterness, only a weary acceptance. When they modernized the program, they archived everything from the old days. Names, faces, context. Easier to teach machines than to remember the men who came before. "Why did you leave?" The question hung between them. Crow watched emotions flicker across the old man's weathered face like shadows of clouds moving over terrain. Pain, guilt, something that might have been shame. "I lost my spotter," Clem finally said. "Kuwait, February 1991. I missed a shot that gave away our position. He took shrapnel pushing me into cover. Died in my arms 90 seconds later." Crow said nothing. She had known Marines who carried similar weights, had seen what that kind of guilt could do to a man over decades. "His last words were in order," Clem continued. "Told me not to stop shooting because of him, but I could not look through a scope anymore without seeing his face. Could not teach without hearing his voice calling wind. So I walked away. Let them erase me from the program. Let myself disappear." The wind gusted hard, sending a student's shot wide. Another miss. Another failure in conditions that seemed designed to break them. "And now you are here," Crow said, watching, needed to see if they still taught it right. "They do not. They teach the machines, not the wind." Crow turned to face him directly. "Could you teach them? The way you used to? The way the machines cannot?" Clem's hands found the chain-link fence, his fingers wrapping around the metal wire. His knuckles went white with pressure. "I made a promise to myself," he said, "when Darnell died, that I would never look through a scope again. The chaplain told me about your conversation," Crow said gently, "about the promise your spotter actually wanted you to keep." Clem was silent. His clouded eyes seemed to see something far beyond the range, beyond the fence, beyond the present moment entirely. On the firing line, a student rose from his position. Failed. Another career ended by conditions that no amount of modern technology could overcome. The young Marine gathered his gear with mechanical movements, his face blank with the particular emptiness of shattered dreams. Clem watched him go, watched another gift wasted, another future abandoned, because no one had taught the boy to trust his eyes instead of his instruments. "That boy who failed out yesterday," Clem said quietly. "Arriaga. What happened to him?" "He is still on base," Crow replied, "packing his gear. He has until tomorrow morning to clear out. He has the gift. The real gift. I could see it in how he watches things, how he processes visual information. He just needs someone to show him what the machines cannot measure. Then show him." The words landed like a challenge. Clem's grip on the fence tightened further, his knuckles gone white with pressure. "You do not understand," he said. "I have not touched a rifle in 33 years. Have not looked through a scope since the day I watched my best friend bleed out in the sand. The weight of that is not something you just set aside because students are failing qualification." Crow stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I understand more than you think. I have carried my own weights, lost my own people, But I also know that hiding under bridges while the knowledge dies with you does not honor anyone. It just means they died for nothing. The words hit Clem like physical blows. He flinched, his weathered face crumpling for just a moment before the mask of composure returned. Darnell would kick my ass for wasting 30 years, he admitted. Would tell me I was being a fool, that the wind does not care about my guilt, that bullets still need to find their targets whether I'm watching or not. Then stop hiding, Crow said. Come inside. Show us what we forgot. Show these students what you showed the Marines who came before them. Clem released the fence, looked at his hands, the hands that had once been the steadiest in the Corps. They were still steady. Despite everything, despite the years and the loss and the weight of guilt that never got lighter, his hands were still steady. The wind shifted, and for just a moment, the chaos seemed to organize itself into a pattern he recognized, a rhythm he had not felt in 3 decades. The old instinct stirring like muscle memory waking from a long sleep. One demonstration, he said finally, if I miss, I walk away and you never see me again. And if you do not miss, Clem thought of Darnell, of the steel penny in his pocket, of all the students who had failed because no one taught them what the machines could not measure. Then maybe I stopped keeping the wrong promise. Word spread through the facility like wildfire through dry brush. The homeless vagrant was coming onto the range. The crazy old man who claimed he used to teach here was going to attempt a shot that none of the instructors had been able to make in 2 days of trying. By the time Crow escorted Clem through the gate, a crowd had gathered at the observation area. Students who had failed stood alongside students still hoping to qualify. Instructors who had dismissed the old man as delusional now watched with expressions caught between skepticism and desperate curiosity. Even the support staff had found reasons to be present, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Vidal intercepted them halfway to the firing line, his face tight with barely controlled fury. This is a mistake, he said to Crow, pitching his voice low enough that only she and Clem could hear. We're going to humiliate ourselves in front of the colonel by letting a vagrant play sniper on our range. The colonel authorized this, Crow replied evenly. The colonel is desperate. That does not mean we should be. Clem said nothing. He was looking at the range, at the targets 1,000 yards distant, at the grass that bent and straightened in patterns that spoke to him like an old language he had never truly forgotten. His hands hung loose at his sides, steady despite the tremor of emotion that moved through the rest of him. Vidal stepped directly into his path, close enough that Clem could smell his aftershave and see the contempt carved into every line of his face. Let me be clear, old man. You get 1 shot. 1. If you miss, you are gone. And I will personally ensure you are arrested for trespassing if you ever show your face here again. Understood, Clem said quietly. And I want on record that I oppose this. That I warned everyone this was a waste of time. When you fail, and you will fail, I want no ambiguity about who is right. Clem met his eyes for the first time. Something in his gaze made Vidal take an involuntary step backward, though he would never admit it. There was steel in those clouded eyes. The steel of a man who had looked through scopes of human beings and made the decision to end their lives. The steel that never fully went away, no matter how many years passed. Understood, Clem repeated. 1 shot. They continued to the firing line. Colonel Stanhope stood near the instructor tower, watching with the evaluating gaze of a man whose judgment would determine what happened next. The chaplain had appeared at the edge of the crowd, her presence a quiet reminder of the conversation that had helped Clem find his way to this moment. And there, standing apart from the other failed students, was Arriaga, the young Marine who had asked about Mirage through the fence, who had shown the hunger to learn even in the moment of his greatest failure. He watched Clem approach with something that might have been hope, though he was trying hard not to show it. The armor-bar rifle. Standard M40A6, the current platform used by Marine Scout snipers. Not the custom weapons Clem had once built relationships with, but a rifle was a rifle. The fundamentals did not change. Clem took it carefully, his hands moving over the weapon with the familiarity of a musician touching an instrument after years away. The stock, the action, the scope that would show him a world he had been avoiding for 33 years. Vidal handed him a Kestrel weather meter. Standard equipment for wind calls. This is how we do things now. Data-driven. Precise. Clem looked at the device, felt its weight in his palm. A useful tool, but just a tool. Incomplete. I do not need it, he said, and set it aside without turning it on. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Refusing standard equipment was either confidence or madness. No one was certain which. Vidal's smile was thin and predatory. Your choice, old man. Your funeral. Clem did not respond. He was already moving into position, lowering himself to the firing mat with movements that were precise and economical. Muscle memory. The body remembering what the mind had tried to forget. The scope. The moment he had been dreading. He settled behind the rifle and brought his eye to the glass, and the world narrowed to a circle of magnified reality that had once been as familiar as his own heartbeat. The target stood 1,000 yards distant, a simple silhouette that had defeated every shooter who had attempted it for the past 2 days. The wind between here and there was a constantly shifting maze of variables that no instrument could fully capture. Clem did not touch the rifle, did not adjust anything. Instead, he lay perfectly still, watching. The grass at 200 meters bent slightly left. At 400, it moved differently, catching a crosscurrent that the near grass did not feel. At 600, a null zone where the wind seemed to cancel itself. At 800, the pattern shifted again, the grass moving right to left with a rhythm that was almost like breathing. The mirage rising from the ground told him more. Heat differentials creating optical distortions that revealed air movement at every point along the bullet's path. The shimmer that most shooters tried to ignore was actually a roadmap, if you knew how to read it. Minutes passed. The crowd grew restless. Vidal checked his watch ostentatiously, performing impatience for the colonel's benefit. Clem ignored all of it. He was listening to the wind, feeling its rhythm, waiting for the moment when the chaos would organize itself into a pattern he could exploit. Darnell's voice whispered in his memory. "Send it, wind reader." "Not yet," he whispered back. "Not yet, brother. We wait for the window." His finger found the trigger, rested there with the patience of a man who had learned long ago that the shot would come when the shot was ready. The wind gusted, shifted, gusted again, and then, in a moment of stillness that lasted less than a second, the pattern aligned. Clem exhaled and sent the round downrange. The sound of the shot rolled across the range like thunder, and then silence fell so complete that the wind itself seemed to hold its breath. Every eye turned to the spotting scopes, every breath suspended. The target stood 1,000 yards away, unchanged from this distance, its fate hidden by the limits of human vision. Crow reached the primary spotting scope first. She pressed her eye to the glass, adjusted the focus with trembling fingers, and went absolutely still. The silence stretched, seconds that felt like hours. "Center mass," she said, and her voice cracked on words. "Dead center." The crowd did not react immediately. The information took time to process, to overcome the certainty they had carried that the old vagrant would fail. Then the murmurs began, spreading through the gathered Marines like ripples from stone dropped in still water. "That is not possible," someone said. "He did not even use the Kestrel," someone else replied. Vidal pushed through to the spotting scope, physically moving Crow aside in his desperation to verify what she had reported. He stared through the glass for a long moment, his face cycling through denial, confusion, and something that looked very much like the beginning of fear. The target showed a single hole, perfectly centered, in conditions that had defeated every shooter and every instrument for 2 days straight. Clem rose from the firing position slowly, his joints protesting the movement back to standing. He did not look at the target, did not need to. He had known the moment the round left the barrel that it would find its mark. The wind had told him, had always told him when he bothered to listen. Colonel Stanhope was walking toward him, his stride purposeful, his face showing an emotion that Clem could not immediately identify. The crowd parted before the colonel's approach, students and instructors stepping aside with the automatic deference of military hierarchy. Stanhope stopped 3 feet away. His eyes were wet. "Wind Reader," he said, and his voice carried the weight of recognition that spanned decades. "My God, you are Wind Reader." The name hung in the air like an echo from another era. Some of the younger Marines looked confused, the call sign meaning nothing to them. But the older ones, the instructors who had studied history, who knew the legends that had shaped their profession, they understood. "Haven't been called that in 30 years, sir," Clem replied. "I was at Camp Lejeune when you gave a lecture on wind reading." Stanhope's voice was rough with emotion. 1989. "I was a butter bar lieutenant who thought I knew everything about shooting. You changed how I understood this entire art. Changed how I taught it for the rest of my career." Clem did not know what to say. The recognition he had avoided for 3 decades was suddenly inescapable, a tide of acknowledgement washing over walls he had built from guilt and grief. "What is your name?" Stanhope asked. "Your real name." "I never knew it back then. Just the call sign everyone used." "Okonkwo. Master Gunnery Sergeant Clement Okonkwo. Retired." A sharp intake of breath from somewhere in the crowd. Crow's voice, barely above a whisper. "The Okonkwo method. That is him. That is actually him." She pushed forward, her tablet in hand, the training manual displayed on the screen. The footnote. The technique that had been relegated to historical curiosity. The name that had been preserved only as a label, stripped to the man who had earned it. "We teach your method," she said, and there were tears running down her face now. "We teach it, but we forgot who developed it. We forgot you." "The technique matters more than the name," Clem said quietly. "Always did." But Crow was shaking her head. "No, no, it does not. Because we lost more than your name when we modernized. We lost the understanding behind the technique. We teach students to read Mirage at a single point, but we do not teach them to synthesize multiple points the way you just did. We reduced your method to a footnote and wondered why it stopped working." Vidal had not moved from the spotting scope. He stood frozen, his hands still resting on the glass, his face pale with the dawning realization of what he had done, who he had mocked, who he had threatened with arrest. Stanhope turned to him, and his voice carried the cold precision of command. "Gunnery Sergeant, do you understand who you have been trying to remove from this range?" "Sir, I do not know." Vidal's voice was barely audible. He looked like what he was. His confidence collapsed, his certainty shattered. "This man wrote the foundation of your wind reading curriculum. His techniques are still in the manual, though apparently his name was removed during modernization." Stanhope let the words land like hammer blows. "And you mocked him, in front of his legacy." Arriaga stepped forward from the crowd, his face showing the particular intensity of a man watching everything he believed being rewritten in real time. The young Marine who had failed out stood before the legend he had spoken to through a fence, finally understanding the magnitude of that brief conversation. "Can you teach us," Arriaga asked, "what you just did? The way you read the wind at multiple points. Can you teach us to do that?" Clem looked at the young Marine, saw the hunger in his eyes, the willingness to learn, the gift that had been wasted because no one had shown him how to use it. Darnell would have liked this kid. "I can try," Clem said, "but first, someone needs to get him back into the program. He should not have failed out for conditions no one taught him to read." All eyes turned to Stanhope. The colonel looked at Arriaga, at Clem, at the crowd of students who had been failed by a system that valued machines over human intuition. "Arriaga is reinstated," Stanhope said, "effective immediately. And anyone else who failed this cycle due to wind reading deficiency gets another chance." He turned to Clem. "If you are willing to teach them." Clem's hand found the steel penny in his pocket, felt the warmth of metal that had passed through 3 generations of warriors. Darnell's voice echoed in his memory, not the dying words this time, but the living ones. The voice of a young man who had believed Clem could do things with a rifle that defied physics. "You are a wizard, wind reader. Straight up wizard." Maybe it was time to pass that magic on. "I am willing," Clem said. The crowd had not dispersed. If anything, it had grown as word spread through the facility that something unprecedented was happening on the known distance range. Marines who had no business being there found reasons to drift toward the firing line, drawn by the gravitational pull of witnessing history. Vidal stood apart from the others, his face still carrying the pallor of a man whose entire worldview had been dismantled in the span of a single shot. He watched as students gathered around Clem, as questions began to flow, as the homeless vagrant he had tried to arrest transformed before his eyes into something else entirely. The gunnery sergeant had built his career on certainty, on the conviction that modern methods were superior, that data-driven precision had rendered the old ways obsolete. Now that certainty lay in ruins, and he did not know how to rebuild himself from the wreckage. Crow approached him, her expression holding neither triumph nor condemnation, just the steady regard of a fellow Marine who understood how difficult this moment was. "You could not have known," she said quietly. "I should have listened." Vidal's voice was hollow. "Should have looked past the appearance. Should have trusted that a man does not watch wind like that unless he knows what he is seeing. You were trained to trust instruments. We all were. The system failed him long before you did." "The system." Vidal laughed bitterly. "We built the system. We chose to prioritize machines over mentorship. We decided that institutional memory was expendable. And now we have an entire generation of snipers who cannot hit a target when their gadgets fail." On the range, Clem had lowered himself back into the prone position, but this time he was not alone. Arriaga lay beside him, and the old man was speaking in low tones, gesturing at the grass, at the mirage rising from the ground, at the patterns that revealed secrets to those who knew how to look. "Watch the mirage at 200 meters, Clem was saying. "See how it bends? That tells you the wind direction and speed at that point. Now look at 400. Different pattern. The wind is doing something else there. You have to see the whole path, not just the point where you were standing." Arriaga nodded slowly, his eyes tracking where Clem indicated. For the first time since his failure, hope flickered in his expression. "I see it," the young Marine said. "The bending is different. More pronounced at 400. Good. Now 600. What do you see there?" A pause. Concentration. Then nothing. The mirage is straight. The wind is not affecting it. "Null zone," Clem confirmed. "The wind at 600 is negligible. But look at 800. What is happening there?" Arriaga studied the distance. His brow furrowed. Then his eyes widened. "It is moving the other direction. The mirage is bending opposite to the near grass. Right to left instead of left to right," Clem agreed. "Cross-current at distance. If you adjusted only for what your Kestrel reads at the firing line, you would miss. The bullet would drift off target in the last 200 meters." Other students had gathered close enough to hear. They listened with the intensity of men who were watching forbidden knowledge being revealed. Techniques, they had been told, were obsolete, suddenly making sense in ways their instrumented training never had. Colonel Stanhope watched from a distance, his expression thoughtful. He turned to Crow, who had moved to stand beside him. "How do we let this happen?" he asked quietly. "How do we let an entire methodology slip through our fingers?" "Modernization," Crow replied. "The push to standardize everything, to make training reproducible and measurable. The old techniques required mentorship, personal instruction, time that the system decided it could not afford. And now we are paying for that decision. We have been paying for years, sir. We just blamed the students when they could not perform in difficult conditions, told ourselves they were not skilled enough instead of admitting we had stopped teaching them essential skills." Stanhope nodded slowly. Then he walked toward the firing line, toward the gathering of students and the homeless legend who was giving them what the institution had taken away. "Master Gunnery Sergeant," the colonel said formally. Clem looked up from his instruction. "I owe you an apology. On behalf of the program you helped build, we should never have removed your name from the record, should never have reduced your work to a footnote." Clem rose to his feet, his movements carrying more vitality than they had an hour before. The act of teaching seemed to be restoring something in him that had been dormant for decades. "The work mattered more than the credit, sir. It always did. But the credit matters for legacy, for continuity. We teach your method, but we forgot to teach who you are and why you developed it. We lost the context that made the technique meaningful." Vidal had approached during this exchange. He stood at the edge of the group, uncertain, his earlier arrogance completely dissolved. "Master Gunnery Sergeant," he said, and his voice cracked on the title. I owe you more than an apology. I owe you accountability for how I treated you, for the things I said. Clem studied him for a long moment, saw the genuine remorse in the younger man's eyes, the beginning of transformation that could either grow into wisdom or curdle into bitterness, depending on what happened next. Gunnery Sergeant, Clem said slowly, you did what you were trained to do. Protected your range. Protected your students. The failure was not in your instincts. It was in what nobody taught you to see. He gestured at the range, at the wind still moving through the grass in patterns that were finally being understood. You want to make it right, Clem continued. Then learn what I am teaching them. Learn to see what the machines cannot measure. And then teach it to the Marines who come after you. That is how you honor what happened here today. Vidal swallowed hard. Then he nodded once, the gesture carrying the weight of a promise. I will, he said. I swear I will. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the range in shades of gold and amber. The wind continued to gust and shift and challenge. But now there were eyes learning to read its secrets instead of instruments failing to capture them. Darnell would have loved this, Clem thought. Would have been right here beside me, making jokes, keeping the mood light while I taught them everything we learned together. Still here, brother, he whispered too quietly for anyone to hear. Still teaching, just like you wanted. The next 2 days transformed the Scouts' sniper school in ways that would ripple through the program for years to come. Clem taught from dawn until the light failed, lying in the grass beside student after student, showing them how to see what the instruments could not measure. He did not lecture from towers or demonstrate from distances. He got down in the dirt with them, put his eye beside theirs, pointed at the subtle movements that revealed the wind's secrets. Not all of them understood. Some minds were too locked into digital thinking, too dependent on data, to trust their own perception. But enough of them got it. Enough saw what Clem was showing them, felt the click of comprehension that came when observation replaced calculation. Arriaga was the first to qualify under the new instruction. His shot flew true through conditions that had defeated him 3 times before, finding its target with a precision that drew applause from the watching crowd. When he rose from the firing line, there were tears streaming down his face. I saw it, he told Clem afterward, his voice shaking with emotion. I saw the whole path, the wind at every distance. It was like the grass was talking to me. It always was, Clem replied. You just learned how to listen. 7 more students qualified that day. Students who had failed repeatedly under instrument-dependent methods. Students who had been ready to pack their gear and abandon their dreams. They walked off the range with their futures restored, converted into evangelists for the techniques they had learned. Vidal threw himself into the instruction with the fervor of a man seeking redemption. He followed Clem's teachings with humility that surprised everyone who had known his earlier arrogance. Asked questions, took notes, practiced alongside the students he had once berated for their failures. I taught them to trust machines, he told Crow during a break in training. Made them dependent on technology instead of developing their instincts. Every student who failed in these conditions failed because of how I trained them. You trained them the way you were trained, Crow replied. The system perpetuated itself. What matters now is breaking the cycle. On the final day of qualification week, the graduation rate reached 73%, higher than any cycle in the past decade, higher than anyone had thought possible given the conditions that had plagued the exercise. Colonel Stanhope made the announcement at the graduation ceremony, standing before the assembled students and instructors with Clem positioned in a place of honor beside him. This week, the colonel said, we were reminded of something essential that we had allowed ourselves to forget. Technology is a tool, not a replacement for human skill. Instruments can inform our decisions, but they cannot make them for us. We had allowed our training to drift away from this truth, and the cost was measured in students who failed not because they lacked talent, but because we failed to teach them what they needed to know. He turned to Clem, and his voice carried across the parade ground with formal gravity. Master Gunnery Sergeant Clement Okonkwo served this program with distinction for over a decade. He developed techniques that are still taught today, though he had shamefully allowed his name to be erased from our records. Today, that error is corrected. Crow stepped forward, carrying a framed document and a photograph. The photograph was new, taken during the week's instruction, showing Clem teaching Arriaga to read Mirage. Beside it was the old photograph from the memorial wall, finally properly labeled. "Your name has been restored to the training manual," Crow announced. "The Algonquin method will be credited to its developer, and these photographs will hang on our memorial wall so that every student who passes through this program will know who you are and what you gave us." Clem accepted the frame with hands that trembled slightly. He looked at the photographs, at the young instructor he had been and the old man he had become, and felt something shift in his chest. A weight lifting that he had carried so long he had forgotten it was possible to set down. "I did not do this for recognition," he said quietly. "Never did." "We know," Stanhope replied. "That is precisely why you deserve it." The ceremony concluded with something unprecedented. Every graduate of the class lined up to shake Clem's hand, to thank him personally for the instruction that had saved their careers. The line stretched across the parade ground, young Marines waiting patiently for their moment with the legend who had emerged from homelessness to change their lives. Arriaga was last. He held Clem's hand longer than the others, his grip communicating things that words could not capture. "You gave me my future back," the young Marine said. "I will never forget that." "Then use it well," Clem replied, "and someday pass it on. That is how we honor the ones who came before us." As the parade ground emptied and the sun began to set, Chaplain O'Yelleran found Clem standing alone near the memorial wall. He was looking at the photographs that now bore his name, his expression unreadable. "How does it feel?" she asked. "To be seen again." Clem was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out the steel penny, holding it up to catch the fading light. "Darnell told me once that the question is not whether you die," he said. "The question is whether you leave something behind that matters." He paused, turning the coin between his fingers. "I think I finally understand what he meant." The chaplain smiled. "And what will you do now?" Clem looked at the range, at the grass, still moving in patterns that whispered secrets to those who knew how to listen. "Colonel Stanhope offered me a position," he said. "Consultant to the program. Part-time instruction. Housing through the Veteran Transition Services on base. And I think Darnell would kick my ass if I said no." He closed his fingers around the penny and slipped it back into his pocket. For the first time in 33 years, the weight of it felt less like guilt and more like purpose. 6 months later, Clem stood at the edge of the known distance range and watched a new class of students learn to read the wind. The transition had not been easy. 33 years of living with guilt and grief did not dissolve overnight. No matter how meaningful the redemption, there were still nights when he woke reaching for Darnell, still moments when looking through a scope brought the copper taste of memory to his mouth. But the nights were fewer now, and the moments passed more quickly. The housing they had provided was modest. A small apartment in the Veteran Transition Complex, barely larger than the concrete alcove he had occupied under the overpass. But it had a bed, a roof, a door that locked, and most importantly, it had a window that looked out toward the range, so he could watch the grass move even when he was not teaching. Arriaga had graduated top of his class and been assigned to a reconnaissance unit deploying in 3 months. He visited Clem weekly, bringing coffee and questions, absorbing everything the old man could teach him about wind and patience and the art of sending death across distances that seemed impossible. "You saved my career," Arriaga said during one of these visits. "But more than that, you changed how I see everything. Not just shooting, everything. I watch the world differently now." "That is what Darnell used to say," Clem replied. "He said I taught him to see what others missed. Took him years to realize I was just teaching him to pay attention." "Your spotter. Tell me about him." So Clem did. For the first time in 33 years, he spoke about Darnell Whitmore without the words catching in his throat like shrapnel. Told Arriaga about the young man from Detroit who laughed too loud and saw too clearly. About the partnership they had built across years and continents. About the final mission in Kuwait and the wind that shifted and the 90 seconds that changed everything. When he finished, Arriaga was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked the question that Clem had been waiting for without knowing it. "The penny you carry, It was his, was it not? His grandfather's. Darnell gave it to me before he died. Told me to pass it to someone who needed it. Clem reached into his pocket and pulled out the steel coin, worn smooth by 4 generations of worried fingers. He held it in his palm, looking at the date that was barely visible anymore. 1943. The year desperation had transformed ordinary metal into something that could carry hope across decades. I have been waiting 33 years to find a right person, Clem continued. Someone with a gift. Someone who would understand what it means and pass it on when the time comes. He held the penny out to Arriaga. The young Marine's eyes widened. I cannot take that. It is yours. It is all you have left of him. It was never mine, Clem said gently. I was just carrying it until I found you. That is how it works. You carry it. You let it remind you that the ones who came before are watching. And someday, when you find someone who needs it more than you do, you pass it on. Arriaga took the penny with trembling hands. The weight of it seemed to settle into his palm, like it belonged there, like it had been waiting for him across all the years and all the hands that had carried it before. I will honor this, he said. I swear I will. I know you will. That is why you are the one. The range had emptied as evening approached, students returning to barracks, instructors completing their reports. Clem walked to the memorial wall, now updated with proper photographs and proper labels. His younger face looked out from behind the glass, frozen in the act of teaching, captured in a moment before grief had carved its marks into his features. Beside that photograph hung a newer one. Clem and Arriaga, lying prone in the grass, the old man pointing at something in the distance while the young Marine tracked his gesture with focused intensity. The caption read, Master Gunnery Sergeant Clement Okonkwo, Wind Reader, continuing the tradition. And beside both photographs, a new addition. A simple frame containing a picture of Lance Corporal Darnell Whitmore, smiling in his dress blues, young and alive, and full of the laughter that Clem still heard in his quietest moments. The caption read, LCPL Darnell Whitmore, 1968-1991, whose partnership and sacrifice helped develop the techniques that continue to save lives. Crow had arranged it, had tracked down the photograph through veterans' records and military archives, had insisted that Darnell deserve a place on the wall alongside the man who had carried his memory for 3 decades. Clem touched the glass gently, his fingers tracing the outline of his spotter's face. Still here, brother, he whispered. Still teaching. And they know your name now. They know what you gave. The wind picked up outside, gusting through the grass in patterns that Clem could read as easily as other men read words on a page. Somewhere out there, a new generation of snipers was learning to listen to what it said, learning to see what the machines could not measure, learning the lessons that Clem and Darnell had written in blood and refined across years of partnership. The legacy would continue. The knowledge would pass from hand to hand, like a steel penny carried across generations, like wisdom shared between warriors who understood that the ones who came before never truly left. They just waited for someone worthy to carry their gifts forward. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that second chances are possible and that heroes sometimes hide in the most unexpected places, please consider subscribing to our channel. And right now on your screen, you will see another incredible story waiting for you. Click it, watch it, and remember what you witnessed here today. The man everyone dismissed, the legend no one recognized, the knowledge that almost died because we forgot to look past appearances. Every person you pass on the street carries a story. Some of those stories are ordinary, but some of them, the ones hidden behind weathered faces and worn clothing and clouded eyes, some of them are legendary. You just have to learn how to see. Thank you for watching.